Hello, my name is Dr. Mary Wardell Garaduzzi, and I am the Vice Provost here at the University of San Francisco. I oversee diversity engagement and community outreach, and I work with a group of faculty, staff, and students to help expand and help us build a stronger USF community, particularly around our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Those individuals make up a council. It's called the Council, the University Council on Diversity and Inclusion, that was launched a little over 2 years ago, charged by Provost Jennifer Turpin to help USF better institutionalize all of our diversity capacities and to provide opportunities for people from multiple areas across the university with representatives across all schools and colleges, a multitude of administrative offices, as well as academic units and students representation work together on ideas and ways that USF can not only build but really aspire to become the 21st century model of an American university grounded in our Jesuit tradition around what does diversity look like, how does diversity behave, and how do you know that you've reached it? Well, our tagline, if you go to the Diversity Office website, is diversity is not just a destination, it is a daily journey. So when people ask me, when do you know you've done enough? You know, is your office built on the ideal of quotas? When is diversity realized? I kind of turned that back over to them, saying that our Jesuit identity really causes us to push more, to look more, and to aspire to be more than what maybe the general public and the current society sees as enough. And so with that, I'd like to introduce one of the co-chairs who helps us with the council. And our introduction today for the speaker is going to be done by, I want to say, are you a doctor yet, Robert? He should be, okay, by Associate Dean Robert Bromfield. He is the university registrar and oversees a lot of the university's functions as regard to how we keep our records, as well as how do we institutionalize many of the things that we do. And he has been very thoughtful as a co-chair in the council. And so, Robert, if I can ask you to join me on the stage, and he will be introducing our speaker for the evening.
Now you see Mary is much taller than I, so I have to lower this. Thank you, Mary. So good evening and welcome. Before I introduce Dean Trasviña, I have two housekeeping announcements. The first is about this evening's format. Dean Trasviña will speak for about 25 minutes. Following his talk, my fellow co-chair, Dr. Shabnam Koryala Azad, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor in the School of Education, will lead a Q&A with Dean Trasviña. The Q&A will last about 30 minutes. And you may pass any questions you have in advance to staff who are in the wings. Where are the staff in the wings? The blue and the red boxes. I thought that was something from, what is that movie? You know, take the red pill, the blue pill, and anyway. But if you could pass your questions to them, in fact, on your chairs, you should have found a pencil and this little slip on the reverses which you can put your questions. And if you could pass them to to Dennis and Christina, that would be great. If not, during the Q&A, you can come up to the microphone and pose your question. The second announcement is that this evening's presentation is being live streamed, and we hope that students, faculty, and staff at our branch campuses and those unable to join us here in McLaren are able to tune in and participate. Those of you who are joining us remotely, welcome. You may also participate in the Q&A. tweeting your questions to @USFDiversity, that's the @ USFDiversity, using the hashtag USFCAUCDI. Again, tweet your questions to @USFDiversity, hashtag USFCAUCDI. So let's get started. On behalf of the Council, University Council on Diversity and Inclusion, and the Office of Diversity Engagement and Community Outreach, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, John Trasviña, Dean and Professor of the University of San Francisco School of Law. We are thrilled and delighted that John has chosen the Council's spring event to deliver his first university-wide talk since becoming law school dean last summer. John D. Trasviña is the 18th dean of the University of San Francisco School of Law. He received his AB from Harvard University in 1980 and his JD from Stanford Law School in 1983. Prior to his arrival at USF, Dean Trasviña served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he led more than 580 employees in 43 offices across the country to enforce the nation's fair housing laws. Previously, John served as President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, where he oversaw 6 litigation and policy offices across the country, expanded services, and significantly increased fundraising efforts. A native San Franciscan, Dean Trasviña began his career as a deputy San Francisco city attorney in 1983, before joining MALDEF in Washington, D.C., as a legislative attorney in 1985. He later worked for U.S. Senator Paul Simon as general counsel and staff director for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. In 1997, President Bill Clinton appointed Dean Trasviña special counsel for immigration-related unfair employment practices. In that capacity, John led the only federal government office devoted solely to immigrant workplace rights and was the highest-ranking Latino attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. Dean Trasviña has taught immigration law at Stanford Law School and was director of the Discrimination Research Center in Berkeley. Always giving back to his community, John was a member of the San Francisco Elections Commission and the American Bar Association Committee on Immigration. He also served as president of the Harvard Club of San Francisco, a board member of the La Raza Lawyers Association, Latino Issues Forum, Campaign for College Opportunity, Lowell High School Alumni Association, and the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership. And that's just to name a few. However, without any further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dean John Trasviña. John.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the very kind and long introduction. It is an honor. It's an honor to be the dean of the School of Law here at USF, and I'm so proud and pleased to be able to work with colleagues like Mary, who takes care of everything, and to be amongst, being at this university, at this community, led, of course, by Father Ravad and our provost, Jenny Turpin, and at the law school, of course, we have so many tremendous faculty, staff, and students, a number of whom are here tonight. So I very much appreciate the welcome and the introduction. I came here to USF to have a meaningful role in the training of the next generation of lawyers and leaders. This is something that is at the core of USF's mission, and it is important to me on a personal and professional level And to me, it is not only being back home here in San Francisco, but by someone who is among the many millions who was inspired by President Kennedy's inaugural address in January of 1961, where he said, "Let us go forth to lead the land we love, knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." These are the words that inspired a new generation. And I might add, they were helped penned. They were the drafter, one of the drafters of the inaugural address, not just President Kennedy alone, but his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, Lowell High School graduate, USF graduate. But when I have had the opportunity, since being dean here since June, to meet not only our students and prospective students, but also our alums. And I think back when we had our reunion last October, the class of '63 was here. I talked to people like Don Carroll, who's a labor lawyer here in San Francisco, adjunct professor. And he told me of his experience of graduating from USF in June of '63, then going to Washington, D.C. to get an LLM at Georgetown. He was, like so many young people, shattered by the experience of being in Washington, D.C. on the day that President Kennedy was shot and assassinated in Dallas, and just the turmoil of those times. But those are the leaders and activists that we produce. Don Carroll, John Burton, chairman of the California Democratic Party, our congressman, our legislator, class of '61, also one of the leaders and activists of the day. But of course, I think our activism is even more pronounced today because of the times, because of the necessity, the needs of people across communities in 2014. We pride ourselves in thinking about San Francisco as the most diverse, the most liberal, the most open, the most progressive city in the country, if not one of the most of those in the world. But it has not always been the case. Being a native San Franciscan myself, being a big baseball fan, I know the story of Willie Mays. When the Giants moved here in 1958, Willie Mays wanted to buy a house. Wanted to buy a house over 74 Miraloma Way, right off of Portola Drive. He was not allowed to buy that house. He was young, African-American, 26 years old. He was greatest center fielder ever, 500 home runs by 1965. He was so great, but not good enough, quote unquote, good enough to buy a house in the neighborhood in which he chose in San Francisco. His experience with housing discrimination in San Francisco so touched him and his wife. It is a whole chapter in his memoirs, and it has gone on to have had an effect on him and how San Francisco was looked at, not as a major league city, because of that instance of housing discrimination. And when I was growing up in town and went to Aptus Junior High, every day I'd walk home down Cedro Way. And my mom would always point out the house on Cedro Way where Cecil Poole lived. Cecil Poole was the first African-American United States attorney anywhere in the country. President Kennedy appointed him in 1962. But a few years before that, some young kids, out of both the idiocy of trying to intimidate Cecil Poole, you could not intimidate Cecil Poole one bit, but yet they burned a cross on his lawn. And that also occurred in our neighborhood. As was mentioned, I led the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. We enforced the Federal Fair Housing Act. The first case that went to the United States Supreme Court about the Fair Housing Act was brought against Park Merced. Our Park Merced right here in San Francisco went all the way to the United States Supreme Court on the Fair Housing Act in 1971 and 1972. So that is another piece of San Francisco history. And when we had the events for the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, I went back and looked at what was going on in San Francisco at the same time. What I found was there was activism. There were demonstrations over on Geary Boulevard at Mel's Diner. Mel's Diner was owned by a member of the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. That member of the Board of Supervisors was running for mayor. African Americans didn't have front of the house jobs. They perhaps were in the back, but they were not serving customers. So students demonstrated against Mel's Driving. They had to sit in. If you look at all the newspaper accounts, you read about the San Francisco State students. You read about the Cal Berkeley students. you do not read about USF students. I would say today that is not a complete picture of USF back in the 60s. We were right next to Haight-Ashbury, the anti-war movement. One of our own professors, Bob Talbot, who is still with us on the faculty, he was a leader in the anti-war movement here on campus. However, at those times back in the 60s, USF was not as present as I believe it would be today because of the changes of our culture and because of the active efforts, whether by Father Brevat and carried out by Mayor in the Office of Diversity, to make sure that we look like the society in which we serve. And those are things that are very, very important to the USF that I came to just this past June. But there was a mood in Washington and around the country for change. Might have been the Peace Corps, the first head being Sergeant Shriver. The Equal Pay Act was passed in June of 1963, and that made clear that no employer could discriminate on the basis of sex by paying wages to employees less than the rate for employees of the opposite sex in jobs that were of equal skill, equal effort, and responsibility, unless there was a existing seniority system, merit system, or a system which measures earnings by quantity or quality of production, or where there is a differential based on factors other than sex. So there were exceptions to the Equal Pay Act, but the basic principle, equal pay for equal work, no differences between the genders, that was one of the first laws that was passed in the civil rights era of legislation, predating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 64, the law that we celebrate, it's half centennial. Title I, related to voting, but the real action on voting came a year later in the 65 Act. Title II, outlawing discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and color for protected classes in public accommodations, grocery stores, movie theaters, and the like. Title III outlawed discrimination along the same grounds in public facilities of local and state governments. Title V expanded the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a commission which has no authority to enforce anything, but in its day was able to focus public attention on civil rights matters, and every time they made a recommendation, even though they did not have the power to enforce that recommendation, every recommendation was later enacted into law. Title VI, something that is used today by this administration and used by only, it's been restricted to federal enforcement. But it stands for the principle under Title VI that a recipient of federal funds, not just the federal government agencies themselves, but the recipients of federal funds cannot discriminate. Title VII, probably the part of the Civil Rights Act that is known best, fair employment, fairness in the workplace, and that is one of the focal points of the Civil Rights Act. The other parts of the Civil Rights Act are not as often considered, but are also critically important. Title X, establishing the Community Relations Service. It's an organization that is federally funded, of offices around the country, currently headed by a young man by the name of Randy Lum, also a San Franciscan, also a Lowell High School graduate. And his efforts and the efforts of his predecessors at the Community Relations Service are to reduce community tensions. Again, not to make decisions, not to enforce, but to bring people together, for people to have a voice and to mediate disputes. A very important, in side by side with the federal law enforcement of the Justice Department and other agencies, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission established under Title VII, but also the CRS, Community Relations Service, bringing people together to help them resolve their own community disputes. Title VIII, of course, is the Fair Housing Act, which actually was not enacted until 1968. This body, this law in 64 is critically important, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But it is the first wave of a number of different pieces of legislation. And when I left Washington last June, my own feeling was that we had accomplished a lot in the first term. Wasn't really sure how much we could accomplish in a second term, and really wanted to come back to San Francisco to train the next generation of lawyers and leaders. If you look at the gridlock in Washington today, it is even more remarkable that you look at the series of laws that passed between 1963 and 1968. We talked the Equal Pay Act, 64, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, ending literacy tests, ending the poll taxes, recognizing for the first time that one of the literacy tests is having everything in English. So for Puerto Ricans born on the island who later moved to New York and Connecticut, for the first time having Spanish language voting materials. Also in 1965, as we are progressing in our own country, our message to the world, in response in part to the emerging African nations, emerging democracies in Latin America, also our message to the world was for the first time in our immigration history, we would admit people to this country irrespective of their region and no longer having what was called the Asian Barred Zone, which drastically limited to just a few hundred of legal immigrants from Asia. So the 65 Act opened up opportunities for people to come, both as students and as family members, for the first time across the board, without regard without any particular region being restricted. Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1966 and 67, such as the first meaningful federal support for public education, bilingual education, Head Start programs. Medicare came through, food stamps came through in 65 and 66. And of course, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and President Johnson went to Congress and said, this must be the nation's response to the assassination of Dr. King in April of 1968. So the question I want to pose is, who made this all happen? Looking at the legislative history of the Civil Rights Act of 64, in his first message to Congress after the Kennedy assassination, in December of 1963, President Johnson told members of Congress that the greatest tribute, the greatest memorial to President Kennedy would be passing the Civil Rights Law that had been just lingering and just sitting around in Congress and not really getting much action. By February the 10th, 50 years and 15 days ago, the House passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by a pretty strong vote of 290 to 130. Now, typically, when a bill goes from one house to the other after it passes, it goes over to it's sent over to the desk, and there the Senate majority, in this case, the Senate Majority Leader, calls the bill up for a first reading. Everybody says, "Oh, you don't have to read it. Like, you don't really have to read it. We'll say you read it," and then it moves to a second reading, and the same thing happens, and then it goes off to a committee for the committee process to move forward. Senator Mansfield, the Majority Leader of the Senate, knew that if the regular order prevailed, what would happen is that the bill would go off to the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by James Eastland of Mississippi. The likelihood that the Civil Rights Act would get out of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1964 or any time after that, under that chairman, was pretty small. So instead, Senate Majority Leader said, we're going to have the second reading, and we're going to keep the bill right here on the Senate floor. And this is going to be the action that the Senate will take. Now, of course, those who opposed the bill, for any number of different reasons, they went to that time-honored traditional way of slowing things down, the filibuster. They filibustered and filibustered and filibustered. Back then, it took 67 votes for the Senate to stop a filibuster, to invoke cloture. No civil rights law had ever survived a filibuster. This time, those who were advancing civil rights prevailed. And later on, by July, by the way, when Senator Mansfield decided to take this tactic, it was 50 years ago tomorrow. By May and June, the filibuster was broken, Republicans and Democratic senators voting to end debate. And by July 2nd, it was on President Johnson's desk, and it was signed into law. Now, you could say, who made this happen? President Johnson, Majority Leader Mansfield, Speaker McCormick on the House side, Republican leaders, whose members also, by large majority, supported the Civil Rights Act, the spirit of President Kennedy. That is, at one level, that's a correct answer. Others would say, well, it's just a natural evolution of American thinking. Progress after World War II, migration of African Americans to northern and western cities, the GI Bill of Rights that opened education, higher education, to people that had never before had been able to achieve the dream of education. Advances in sports, Jackie Robinson's being a model for people. Tonight is the 50th anniversary, I note, of Cassius Clay, later known as Muhammad Ali, becoming world's boxing champion for the first time. So there were many of our civic and many of our cultural institutions were changing. But I would say more people, many others, would look to the activism of black churches and white churches of many faiths and synagogues. Look to Dr. King. Look to the Student Nonviolent and Coordinating Committee in the South, the NAACP, organized labor, other leaders in the South and across the country. But no answer to who was responsible for passage of the Civil Rights Act, no answer would be complete unless students and young people were at the core of that answer. Some of these young people would be very similar to our own professor of law, Peter Honigsberg. Peter, he himself actually didn't show up to the movement until 1966. While he was in law school, he came a little bit. Even by his own admission, he says he came a little bit late. I think he came young as well. Peter followed many college and law students from the North who joined the struggle, and I commend his book, Crossing Border Street, to anyone who wants a very candid and forthright viewpoint of someone who was there. The epic power struggles, the dangerous interactions with local authorities, and at the same time, a real caution on the part of Peter and others not to be perceived as the big brothers and big sisters coming from the North to the South, but letting people fight for their own freedoms. I think Peter's activism and the impact that this era had on him, I think is demonstrative of so many of our faculty and staff, my colleagues at the law school, who take the law and shape the law and use it and live it in ways that had not been done in previous generations. But students fighting for freedom and equality, it's really not unique to the civil rights movements of the 1960s. The movement, after all, was not just about one piece of legislation. It was about so many changes in our philosophy, changes in the way of life for everyone. The civil rights movement brought about both resulting in deaths of some students, some who were targeted by those who were standing up for oppression, but others. But it also brought about really historic levels of courage. And I think back 1960, Woolworths, the sit-in there, 64 years ago this month, the Greensboro Four, students from North Carolina A&T, sat down at a Woolworths lunch counter because the African Americans, they were not allowed to be served. This inspired citizens everywhere. One of the Greensboro Four, Franklin McCain, passed away last month at the age of 73. But consider this as well. As I was preparing for this speech, I came across the February 25th, 1964 edition of something called The Student Voice. It's a newspaper that was published in Atlanta 50 years ago. Just read you some of the articles that are on the front cover. Georgia judge gives co-ed 18 months. An 18-year-old white girl, a student at Connecticut College for Women, was sentenced here February 20th to 6 months in the common jail, 12 months on the public works. She was fined $1,000. The girl, Martin Walker, formerly an exchange student at Spelman College, was arrested during a January 13th sit-in attempt at a segregated restaurant. She was charged with violation of Georgia's trespass law, passed in 1960, after student anti-segregation demonstrations began. Over in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, leaders call 72-hour truce. Anti-segregation demonstrations have been halted for 72 hours while mediators attempt to negotiate a settlement between Ray's Barbecue and members of the Pine Bluff movement. Dick Gregory, jailed with student director William Hanson, left the Phillips County Jail to make contact with federal officials to complain about jail conditions. It's like somebody's secret torture chamber, Gregory said. Reverend Benjamin Greenedge, chairman of the Pine Bluff movement, was fired at during a demonstration on the evening of February 20th. The owner of the restaurant told the group, "I am the owner. This is private property. Why do you want to integrate me? If you come up on the sidewalk, I'll shoot you. God didn't mean it for it to be like this." And on and on. Baseball star cancels meeting. Former baseball star Stan Musial canceled an appearance at a segregated meeting in Jackson, Mississippi. John Lewis, chairman of the Student Nonviolating Coordinating Committee, had asked the St. Louis Cardinal star to cancel in a letter. High Court hears boycott case. The United States Supreme Court heard arguments Thursday, February 20th, in defense of a worker for the Student Nonviolating Coordinating Committee charged with encouraging a student boycott at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. 2 days after speaking on campus at Southern University, he was charged with trespassing, vagrancy, and disorderly conduct, charges of criminal anarchy, carrying a maximum 10-year sentence for speaking at the college. These were the stakes that the students took on, and this is what students in Maryland and in Canton, Mississippi, all throughout. This is what students were taking on, both students who lived in the South, but also students who came to the South to take on and combat. The students were at the heart of this effort. But it should not be that much of a surprise that young people were at the core, because they've been at the core of other social movements as well. We can look back to 1873, a young man by the name of Wong Kim Ark, born in San Francisco. He went on a trip to China in the 1890s. At the age of 22, he was just going on a short trip. He came back in. He was 22 years old, and our government said, "You can't come in. Chinese Exclusion Act. Didn't you hear? You're not allowed in." He says, "I'm not coming back. I'm not coming in. I'm coming back. I was born here in San Francisco." And he had to go all the way to the United States Supreme Court for the proposition that if you're born in this country, you're a citizen of this country. That was a law, and with all the rights attached to citizenship. That was a principle. We didn't apply it to Native Americans. We didn't apply it to African Americans. 14th Amendment made it clear. Wong Kim Ark was the first to take it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, a principle that comes in Anglo-American law way back to 1608. But it was Wong Kim Ark. He lived over at 751 Sacramento Street, and he was the one, as a 22-year-old, who went to the United States Supreme Court. Or consider Raymond Parpart. Raymond was a fifth grader in Zion County, Nebraska in 1923. He and his fellow students were being taught by Mr. Meyer. They were being taught German during lunchtime. A lot of German-American immigrants in the Midwest at that time. World War I, the aftermath of World War I. Like other Midwestern states, such as South Dakota and Ohio, Nebraska passed the official language law and made English the official language of Nebraska. They barred German from being taught in the classroom at the elementary school level. So one day, because the district attorney had heard that Mr. Meyer was teaching Raymond, and Raymond was reciting the lessons like his other students, the district attorney visited the class and saw, to his horror, people learning German, young people learning German at lunchtime. They charged Mr. Meyer. The German-American parents in the community were outraged, so they helped Mr. Meyer take his case to the local judge. The local judge said, "You're violating the law." They got lawyers, they appealed to the Nebraska Appellate Court. They lost there as well. They went to the Nebraska Supreme Court and lost there as well. And what were the arguments on the other side? The arguments presented by Nebraska state officials were that, well, German is the official language of Nebraska. English is the official language of Nebraska, so you should be teaching English. They also said that, well, it's German. You don't know what they're talking about. Maybe they're trying to reenact the war, start all over again, internal espionage. The Nebraska education officials also said that, and I'm sure they would flunk out at our education school, because their other argument was that the brain was too small for elementary school children to have two languages rolling around in it at the same time. But these were the arguments that were accepted by the Nebraska courts. Well, there's one other place where people can go for justice, and that's the United States Supreme Court. And when you walk up those stairs, you see where it's equal justice under law. And Raymond and his teacher and the parents of Zion County, Nebraska, all they wanted was for their children to learn German so they could read them the Bible, the Lutheran Bible at home. They had to go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in Meyer versus Nebraska, in 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the protection of the Constitution extends to all, and whether you speak English or not. And perhaps it would be great if everybody spoke the language, but you don't get there by limiting people's constitutional rights. And there are so many other examples of young people being active and being really standing ahead of others. So we look at today's students, and we look at how we are training the next generation of lawyers and leaders, and its importance to the University of San Francisco, service to our community, service to our city, service to those who need legal services. One of the most important issues today in America is comprehensive immigration reform, an issue where, again, students have shown passion, students have shown activism. The nation's demographics are growing Latino, Asian American populations, non-citizens populations, are a cause of, are one of the areas that require us to take a look at our immigration policies. We as an entire nation, we're all getting older, and replacement workers is another aspect of immigration reform. It's been almost 30 years since the enactment of the last major piece of immigration legislation, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. We currently have a breakdown of the current system. Families are separated. There's uneven enforcement. The business needs for labor are not being met, whether they are in the high-tech fields of Silicon Valley or the not-so-high-tech fields of San Joaquin Valley. And the rule of law. Every nation gets to decide who enters and who stays. But that decision must reflect the needs of the society itself. It's not enough to have a policy that benefits just those who need it. We need a policy that reflects the nation's needs. And this is the case that the Dreamers make today. I hope all of you know who the Dreamers are and what they stand for. The Dreamers are those young people who, and their friends and allies and advocates, who seek to have immigration status. They came to this country at a very, very young age. They didn't decide themselves to come here. Their parents brought them. Their parents came without status, but when their children come, their children go to our schools. They become more integrated and acculturated in the society. So today they say to us, if we're going to be sent back, we're being sent back to a place where we've never been. We may or may not have any relatives back there. We may not have any connections. We may not even know the language of our parents' ancestry. That is their case. And their case also is we have contributed to this country, to this society, by being good students, many of whom have gone on to military service. So the DREAM Act, which has been at times bipartisan legislation, sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, but depending, I think, on the times, because the substance of the law doesn't change that much. But it is an effort to say that because those students don't have a home to return to, their future is here, and we would benefit by them being here, that there would be a process established so that they could come forward and be on a path to legal status. This is the case made by the Dreamers today. And this is the case that is one that I, as dean, I'm not here to present a policy. I don't have a policy agenda. I don't take a position. But my job, our job, is to prepare students to lead. And those Dreamer students are leaders. Recently, talked to one of our adjunct professors, and she was telling me that our adjuncts, they work in their careers while they're not teaching. They come over to teach a class in the evening. She teaches about predatory lending. And she had what is probably one of the best experiences for a professor. One of her former students was the opposing counsel in one of her cases. Now, her opposing counsel, she teaches about predatory lending. Her opposing counsel, her former student, was representing the bank. She said he did a great job, but she prevailed. So we got she in effect got the best in terms of being able to know that she helped produce a good student and a good lawyer, but also she felt that her side had won. But at the School of Law, we provide a legal education that promotes excellent lawyering by highlighting oral and written communication skills. Head of our legal writing research program and our librarian we're just here. Grounded in the communities, skills training, mastery of substantive law, and an understanding of people. But we do so in an environment that looks like the California and our nation of tomorrow. Now, it's no surprise to any of you that we've been a majority women at USF School of Law since about 1989. But we're also today a majority students of color. A third of our faculty are faculty of color. And it's not just about numbers and backgrounds and ethnicity. It is about establishing a learning environment that prepares our students for the juries, the clients, the companies, and the decision makers that they will see and lead in their careers. An important part of the student role today is to be that beacon of hope, that hand up to college and high school students and members of our communities who do not have legal training. So when I say a prospective law student, yes, we look at their LSAT. Yes, we look at their undergraduate GPA, those traditional indicators, but we're also asking who else? When we admit that student, who else's legal protections are we advancing? Who else has that student advocated for, and who else will that student advocate for? Whose lives and conditions are touched and improved when we train that prospective student to be an attorney? And we've got one of the best academic support programs in the country, and so many of our alums tell us that USF, back in the day, took a chance on them, perhaps when other schools did not. And they are some of the most successful trial attorneys and other kinds of attorneys here in San Francisco and across California. A year or so ago, a National Journal publication published 2 articles, and in one of which was their cover story, "In Nothing We Trust." It described the downward spiral of faith the American people have in virtually every institution of our lives. The ones we trusted as children and in previous generations, our schools, our political parties, our presidents, governors, Congress, the news media, businesses, unions, and yes, churches, did not fare very well in that survey. I think that is the reality that America faces today. A second article also talked about the future demographics of this nation, and there's where we saw a difficult divide. A divide that, contrary to all past generation, white parents who were surveyed were less convinced that their children would have a better future than theirs. And when it came to the question of diversity, a good number of those parents felt it weakened rather than strengthened America. By contrast, Latino and African American parents surveyed by the National Journal still believed that tomorrow would be better for their children and that increased diversity would lead to greater equality. So this is the challenge for all of us, and particularly for our students. But let me leave you with the words of the man who signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2nd, 1964. On calling upon Congress to pass the Fair Housing Act, Title VIII, President Johnson later said, "The time to act is now." So to those of you who are nursing students, training yourselves to improve healthcare access, the time to act is now. If you spend your time at the Los Galvos Science Center to find cures for diseases and make other scientific advancements, the time to act is now. The School of Education under Dean Comishiro, obtaining quality education, saving City College, ending bullying and hate in our schools, training young people for a technology world, the time to act is now. At the Leo McCarthy School for the Common Good, promoting fair elections, public service, honest politicians, increased citizen participation, responsive government, the time to act is now. The School of Management, promoting bigger profits and successful companies with fair treatment of workers, workplace safety, without discrimination or degradation of the environment, the time to act is now. And across this great university, changing the world from here, the time to act is now. Your vision for the future does not have to rise or fall on the next 50 years, Let's just take the next 15 years. 15 years from now will be the year 2029, the centennial of the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King. Your decisions today will shape your careers and your worlds over the next 15 years. And what you can learn today will help improve the world for students who are kindergartners right now. In 2029, they'll be your age, ready to be the leaders of their own generation. But the time to make that happen then is right now. So all of us here at USF are here to train the next generation of leaders, and in my case, lawyers. The time for all of us to act is now. Thank you all very much. Over here.
So we're going to move forward with the Inside the Actors style, and Associate Dean Shabna Kerala will lead us through that.
Thank you so much, Dean Trasviña, for a very inspiring talk. I almost feel like we should cut this part and go do something productive, since the time to act is now. We are, I think, I speak for everyone when I say we're so humbled by your wisdom and, again, so inspired by your overview of the historical kind of context of even where we are situated right now. So thank you for your talk, and also on behalf of the University Council on Diversity and Inclusion, we have a small token of appreciation here. It's a basket of goodies, and it'll probably make your walk home a little bit more uncomfortable, but thank you. I will give this
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words.
So to the audience, thank you all for being here, and we have about 20 minutes for questions. So there's a microphone to our right over here. If anyone is bold enough to step up to the mic, you're welcome to do that. And there's some question boxes here as well that you can pass on.
If this is a law school setting, I can ask questions of the audience.
Sure. And maybe while the questions are being collected, I was really, I think, touched and inspired by your idea of training lawyers and leaders, a new generation of lawyers and leaders. And it got me thinking, your stories kind of made me think about structural inequalities and inequities then and structural inequities now, and the example of dreamers and how they're really kind of using their agency to try and address some of these inequities. So I'm kind of curious to know, in the law school, how are these motivated law students being trained and prepared to advocate and to accompany those who are kind of traditionally left out and marginalized. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Last summer, President Obama was asked how to reduce the cost of education. And one of his ideas was, well, maybe law school should be 2 years rather than 3 years. And unfortunately, I had to correct and be opposing my old boss in this aspect. Because we pride ourselves on not just the third-year law school, but really starting from the beginning. And some of the types of classes and offerings that we have of getting students in front of whether it's a patent and trademark board, of helping people achieve their dreams of being able to start a company. The other day, I got a letter from a woman who had come to one of our clinical programs, because she had wanted to start a small business. And even before she got it off the ground, a larger company was trying to squash that from happening. She came to us, we were able to review the legal documents, and she wrote back in such appreciation that her dream was able to be fulfilled because USF professors and students were there to help her when she would otherwise not invest in a lawyer, not invest in having the legal parts. I mean, all these entrepreneurs they by definition they're thinking outside the box, and they're focused on their product, they're focused on their idea. They're not necessarily focused on business formation. They're not necessarily focused on following the tax and employment and other kinds of laws. So we help them do that, and that I think is as much part of empowering people as some of the more traditional types of civil rights laws. Now we do that as well. We send students to the South, working on death penalty cases, on death penalty appeals. We pride ourselves on our international human rights work. So there are a variety of ways in which students have access to really professors who are leading in the field, but also access to clinical opportunities, externships, internships, to be able to use their legal skills right away.
Thank you. I have a good number of questions now that we'll see how many we can cover. This question is, many of the challenges from the 60s remain, but they have been couched differently. What new strategies need to be created?
I would answer that in a couple of ways. When I was president and general counsel of MALDEF, we prided ourselves as a law firm for the Latino community to be able to go into court and block bad policies, bad legislation, bad laws, bad actions. And in my view, we were missing an opportunity to explain to the public, have the people who were not really paying attention to our issues to have the issues framed earlier. And frankly, the ability to find a judge who's going to issue that temporary restraining order or injunction, it's harder and harder these days. But getting involved in the legislative fight and taking on the immigration issue, not just that immigration, for example, reform is good for those without documentation or good for those students, but it is essential for the nation, so that as we look at these issues, whatever issue it may be, as we approach it not just as it is good for our community, but it is essential to the American values, essential to the American economy, essential to our strength of our communities. When we cast our agenda in that frame, it invites people to jump on board, to be part of it, at least reconsider their own views. And I think in that way, we are able to stand for our principles, but also I think have greater success.
Thank you. Next question. While advances have been made in San Francisco, quote, driving while black, end quote, is still a common reason why police officers pull over young black men. No tickets or arrests are made, just unchecked harassment. How can this be addressed in such a progressive city?
It ought to be addressed in a progressive city, and in particular, when we have a USF grad as the chief, we've got a couple of USF law grads on the police commission, and we've got a number of elected officials, and we're a small city. We're 49 square miles. We should be able to have a system and a government that is responsive to the basic needs, to be able to say, in transparency, well, what do the numbers look like? What do the arrest patterns look like? And what kind of training do people have? So again, it is, some would say, let's go straight to litigation. Others would say, on a governmental level, let's look at greater means of oversight. Others would say, let's make sure that there's greater police training. Others would say, let's have dialogue among respected church and community leaders with the quote-unquote powers that be. So there are a variety of ways of taking on this issue and other issues. Sometimes it requires going down and picketing somebody, but there are also other means as well.
So this question is asking for some inspiration across generations. It says, you talk about the 60s and how many students were a part of movements and being active. And nowadays, our generation gets deemed as the doomed generation, doomed to increase student debt and various other struggles. So how does this new generation move forward and defy those stigmas?
That is a pretty difficult question. And I fully understand, because I understand it from one standpoint. Talking about the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington or the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. Now, if you're in your 50s like me, it resonates. But if I went to college from 1976 to 1980, if somebody came on campus and started talking about what the 50th anniversary of something, that would be pre-Depression, back in the 1920s. So there's a long gap, and we who are older can't just assume that you mention a few names, everybody's going to know what it means. So for one, it is, and many people, we say, okay, well, ask your parents or your grandparents. Well, maybe their parents or grandparents didn't live here at that time, or they were busy doing other things. So I think those of us who know this history and have lived it, need to go the extra mile to explain and understand. But second is also for us to be and I think as we talk about the type of experiences that occur, there are things that do transcend across generations. And I think students will be inspired. I was inspired the first time I heard about Wong Kim Ark, a young man, 22 years old, going all the way to the Supreme Court back in the 1800s. I didn't need to be Chinese American. I didn't need to be living in that era or being close to that era, but it was an inspiration. And when I look at my own experience, there were not many Latino lawyers in San Francisco when I was growing up. Some Francisco Cancino, a lawyer at the EEOC, one of the first Latino lawyers I ever knew. But I would look to people in other communities, and I think we all have, as educators, as people on this campus, we all have the obligation to reach out to students of all different backgrounds and interests to be able to help them along the next road, and our college students, our law students, to help college students help high school students.
Thank you. You had shared some examples of housing issues in San Francisco, and this question kind of builds off of that. How do we solve the current problem of affordability that affects everyone, but especially low-income groups?
How much time do we have?
Just a few minutes.
This is, well, yeah,
in 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes. How
Please.
are you
No.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is difficult. It's one of the biggest challenges. When I was at HUD, this is one of the biggest challenges that we had, both in terms of the public stock of housing, as well as the private market, and understanding that we are in a city where everybody wants to be. And when everybody wants to be, it has market impacts. There are a variety of different ways of tackling the problems. Some can be, at first glance, very attractive, and then they become counterproductive. I don't have a silver bullet to say here's how to do it, but it requires more talking to each other than at each other. And I think one of the key things we did when I was at HUD was, in the past, the real estate industry was not a big supporter and proponent of the Fair Housing Act when it was first enacted. But because of the way the real estate industry has changed, more and more people of color, organizations of African American, Asian American, Latino real estate agents, that I went to those groups as the conscience of that industry, and we were able to work in partnership on fair housing. Whereas in the past, the industry would not be there because of the advocacy and leadership of many of the people in the industry, and many of them coming right here from San Francisco. It made a difference. So I think through dialogue and through reaching sort of like non-traditional partners, this problem and others will need to be solved.
Jumping now to another topic. What impact do you think Lau versus Nichols had on San Francisco, or has on San Francisco?
Well, here's an example of, if you were here in the 60s and 70s, you know what Lau versus Nichols is. Or if you're at the education school, you know what Lau versus Nichols is. But otherwise, you might not know. Well, Kinney Lau was a young man. He went to Galileo High School, and he was in Chinatown. While the stereotype was all the Asian American kids, Chinese Americans are really smart, but also shut out of most of the public schools of San Francisco because we had school limits, and there were also housing limits on the Chinese American community. So Kinney Lau was brought up in an environment where English was not very available to him. And Chinese American parents went to, using the Civil Rights Act of 1964, went to the federal government, at that time the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and sued under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and said that San Francisco was in effect discriminating because they were limiting access to English language classes to Chinese Americans. And Kinney Lau's case was a subject of a lot of national attention, a lot of national debate. It ended up with a settlement. Nichols was the president of the school board back then, and San Francisco started to implement more bilingual programs. And now we see the Chinese immersion programs and some of the other language immersion programs are some of the most desirable programs with the longest waiting list to get in. So I think in San Francisco, whether it's the Lau decision or other decisions, we've had a change of heart in terms of how we value language in different languages. And now we see language as an asset, and as I said, the parents of all different backgrounds want to have their children in an educational setting where they can learn a second language and really learn it.
Maybe this is the last question, or we have, all right. So this question, a member of the audience says as they look around the room, they wish that the room was packed with students because, it's so important to learn about civil rights law. And so the question is, what responsibility does the institution have to teach about civil rights law? So your thoughts on that?
I think for a school that talks about changing the world from here, for a school that has a very strong focus on diversity, where it's carried out not just by the Office of Diversity, but others carry that responsibility as well, that it is very, very important. And beyond that, so that's why it is important for this school to do that. We are the University of San Francisco, and that should mean something, not just for service to the city and county of San Francisco, but across the world. We are situated in a city that considers itself international, considers itself very mature in a way that other cities are more parochial. So for those reasons, we have a special obligation. We also have, as a Jesuit institution, and I believe, and one that believes in the world and believes in excellence, the moral obligation to be advancing equality, to be advancing justice. We as at the law school certainly take that seriously. And beyond that, any school should be looking at the civil rights movement from the standpoint of sociology, from the standpoint of the movement of peoples, from legislation, from a variety of different perspectives. So the civil rights laws are a good way to study history and a good way to study what's going on in the future. And the one thing I think about students is that they don't turn off their studenthood. Students, particularly law students, when they go home for the first time at Thanksgiving or Christmas, if there's a law student in the family and the first law student in the family, first student to member of the family to go to law school, they're surrounded by cousins, uncles, this legal problem, that legal problem. They're suddenly become the experts. And that I think is important because particularly students of college, but I think all students and lawyers, we don't turn off being a lawyer once we go home at night. And again, particularly in minority communities, we're often the leaders of those communities. There's a reason why you look at the status of lawyers in the country. In the majority community, lawyers aren't all that highly regarded. But among minority communities, lawyers are highly regarded because lawyers are often the difference between the young person driving while black getting out or not, or the person with a deportation problem, or the person with an eviction problem. The lawyers in the community are the ones who make the difference. And I think as we look at our education, it's not just an education from books, it's an education for life. And that, I think, is really what sets the USF apart. And I'm very, very proud to be part of this community, and I'm very appreciative of the welcoming that I've had over the past few months.
Well, there's no doubt we are incredibly fortunate to have you here at USF, and thank you again so much for sharing your insights and for inspiring us to go and do something, because the time is now. So,
Thank you.
thank you.